Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be with everyone. I was asked to join all of you this particular weekend, and it was presented that the fourth principle was the theme. I really just kind of thought about these times that we're in and the challenges that we all have faced, not only with the pandemic, but with all the divisiveness in our country and in the world. Uh, I thought of a quote from the early beginnings of our country, which was, "These are times that try men's souls." And certainly we've all been tried with a divisive election and the continuing divisiveness that has occurred. And so we have these times, and they continue. We even with the election, while things have softened, the divisiveness is still ever present. And so as I've been thinking about this, um, I've really been just kind of thinking about what voice do we listen to? What voice do we listen to? And there was this very famous Swedish, I would call him a mystic. His name is Emanuel Swedenborg. If you don't know of him, he's quite an underappreciated character in our history. Because back in the 1700s, he literally wrote books on engineering, geology, spirituality, psychology, psychiatry, medicine. He created a diagram of the brain, and most of it over the years has proven that he was way ahead of the curve. So he's kind of a unique individual. He definitely lived a very mystical kind of life. But one of the things that I've taken from him is this idea of what's a higher voice and what's a lower voice. Because he spent many years just listening to people that we would call insane. And he began to realize that with lower voices, they're harsh, they're divisive, they beat on the person's being and soul. And the higher voices somehow elevate us and have us have more of a feeling of connection and belonging. And so he delineated the two kinds of voices that people might hear inside. And I'm using that as an analogy because here we are in this time where you can present facts to someone who has very strong beliefs, like QAnon, for example, or maybe they have beliefs about defunding the police. And if you present facts counter to their beliefs, like any delusion, since I started professionally working in psychiatry, when you present a belief, a fact to a strong delusional belief, they entrench themselves even more. And so it kind of speaks to the fact that we have all this divisiveness, and and not only the divisiveness as a country, but how many people, maybe for each of you individually, do you have people that you can no longer talk to? Maybe they're family members, maybe they're friends. Well, literally, the divisiveness has caused a split. How do you engage? And I think that that's the challenge of our time. How do we engage in order to break through this wounded divisiveness that confronts all of us in this time? And one of the things that I've come to understand has been that you don't talk to the mind where we hold these beliefs, but you talk to the heart. I've thought about many stories that I could share because um, I've had opportunity, often not planned, to be engaged with white supremacists in dialogue, to be engaged with members of the Muslim Brotherhood who are also members of Al Qaeda. Um, Certainly, working to even just dialogues with people in today's world where they hate masks, don't want to wear masks, don't believe that the virus is real. But as I thought about this, I I keep going back to the first time that I worked in a federal prison. I was invited in to work on spiritual development with people with addiction. And the first circle of men that they brought in for me to work with using the indigenous tools that I used, there were 45 men for each circle for 3 hours. And what was unique was that 44 of the men were black African American men and one white man. And I thought to myself, there must be something going on here because this is really weird. And I just did my thing, which is I talked about trauma and wounding and how indigenous people see the wound to the soul and how do we heal that spiritually. And and this is probably 20 some years ago. But so I did this talk, and then we had a ceremony. The prison literally provided us with a powwow drum, and I had the men drumming, and we did a healing ceremony. And the men shared their experiences, and there was a lot of crying, which is unusual in prison because in prison, everything you say and do will and can be used against you. And yet, people were into this spiritual experience that had been provided. And when the morning was over, since I was working in 3 hour time blocks, the one white man came up to me and said, I think you're, I'm going to censor out the cuss words, full of, but I have to say something about what you said sounded true to me. And I really want you to do healing with me. And then he proceeded to call me a bunch of other names, partly because of, I am a Jewish man. I was raised Jewish. And I asked his staff if I could meet with this man. Well, this man turned out to be the former head of the KKK. He was in federal prison for murder and church burnings and who knows what else. And in the midst of all that, I came to see and know his wounding. And that's part of what we don't see when we feel like we want to pull away from a conversation that's intense. Because trust me, he was intense. Um, and so in that dialogue and the ceremony that we were to come together, for years he and I wrote. We continued that dialogue. And he softened and he changed because he could acknowledge how his own wounding and pain had fed his hate and his hatred. In the indigenous way, when we have pain inside, we want to give it to somebody else. They call that a spiritual illness. We want to give that violence to someone else. And that was the story of his childhood. It was filled with violence. So I share that story in part because it raises this issue of how do we stay in an intense, divisive conversation with someone who has such strong views that are different than our own. And for me, those tools are relatively consistent. One of them is it starts with detachment. And I don't mean detachment by a disconnection. I mean detachment by what the space at which I can be fully present and open-hearted to the dialogue that happens. That can't always be true, but it just means what distance can I step back and really hear what's going on. And then the second part of it is to stay centered, to stay centered in myself. And to me, that means staying centered in faith, in your beliefs, in your strong core of who you are. And here we are as a community of faith. How do we stay in our faith, in our beliefs? I'm not saying that's easy. I'm just saying that that's, to me, is part of the challenge of staying in those divisive connections. The next part is I've learned over and over again that it doesn't help to talk to the mind. When they say something that they believe, I just acknowledge it. I listen. I don't challenge it. Instead, I talk to their hearts. So, for example, I was in a hardware store. I live in rural Wisconsin in a small town, and the guy that was waiting on me for my paint was going on and on and on about how he hated to have to wear a mask at his work. They don't work. It's full of crap, using his word, and that there was science proving that they don't work. And he went on and on. And I listened to him, and then I just said, well, I don't know who to listen to either. Going to this thing about lower voices, higher voices. I just said, I don't know what to believe either. But what I do know is I'm not going to take that chance because I have granddaughters. And I love my granddaughters. And they're the most important things in the whole wide world to me. And when I said granddaughters, I saw him go into granddaughters. And I told him a story about my granddaughters. And then he started telling me a story about his. And the next thing you know, we had a 45-minute conversation over my paint. And when the whole thing was over, well, we were talking about all sorts of things about the country and our worries and why can't people just get along and the whole thing. But in the end, he turned to me at the end and said, thank you so much for hanging out with me. This was a really important conversation to me. You almost made me want to vote for Joe Biden. And I laughed. But the point being is that somehow if we can touch the heart, we can find a way into that state of connection. But we are living in kind of strange times in terms of what do people worship. That's part of what we have to listen for. What do people worship? If it's QAnon or conspiracy theories, and the conspiracy theories are on the right and the left, people are worshiping them in some way. And we live in a time that I would say worship the self. That people take selfies. I've never taken a selfie. I'm not sure I even know how to do it. But we live in this time with it's so focused on ourselves that we've forgotten that we are social animals and that we need to engage in order to move through the wounding of these times. And that's difficult work. There's no question that that's difficult work. Because the opposite of living in the world of self is to live in the world of us. And the world of us, unlike the world of self, which is about rights, I have a right to this, I have a right to that, you don't have a right to tell me this, and you don't have a right to do this. The world of us is really about relationship. It's about what we share, what brings us together. And the indigenous view, since that's what I try to live in my own life, is to understand that we have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to our family, to our community, to the world. Here we are in a time of climate change. That's something that involves all of us. And so I guess I would just say that whatever the challenge might be in terms of engaging, just to remember the notion of how can I bring heart to this conversation? How can I stay centered in my faith? And in that way, trying to engage in order to build trust, love, and relationship with whoever that other may be in front of you. So that's what I want to share with you today. Thank you so much.